Long before satellites could track storms, ancient storytellers preserved warnings of earthquakes and floods inside their myths. Across the globe, from the Greeks to the Maya, tales of angry gods and world-ending floods were not mere fantasy. They were a sophisticated form of ancestral knowledge, a durable code for survival information passed carefully from one generation to the next. In this exploration, you will learn how to read these ancient stories as the precise disaster forecasts they truly were, uncovering a lost science hidden for centuries in plain sight. We will reveal how a civilization's entire history with a volcano could be captured in the legend of a single fire goddess, and why cultures with no contact all told the same story of a great flood. By the end, you will see mythology not as simple fiction, but as a forgotten library of geological data. What story from the ancient world has always made you wonder if it was more than just a story? Think of a myth not as a bedtime story, but as a hard drive. In a world without written records, these narratives were the most sophisticated data storage systems available. They packaged complex observations about the natural world into memorable, character-driven plots that could survive for centuries through oral repetition. A community's survival could depend on remembering which mountain was once a volcano, or which valley was prone to flooding. This crucial information was too important to be left to chance, so it was woven into the very fabric of their cultural identity. The tale of a sea god's rage was not just an exciting adventure, it was a coded warning about tsunami frequency and coastal inundation. The story of a sky deity's wrath could detail the precise wind patterns and seasonal timing of destructive hurricanes. These narratives preserved the empirical data of countless generations of observers, even when the original reasons for the observations were long forgotten. The next time you hear an ancient myth about a god shaking the earth, ask yourself what that civilization might have been trying to tell you across the millennia. Their survival manual is waiting in their stories. The story of a great flood is perhaps the most persistent echo in human history. From the ancient Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical account of Noah, these narratives are separated by continents and centuries, yet they are built from the same core elements. A higher power issues a warning, a chosen family builds a survival vessel, a catastrophic deluge rises to cover the earth, wiping the slate clean. This is not a coincidence. It is a collective memory preserved with stunning accuracy. Modern geology has uncovered the likely source of this shared trauma. Around 7,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, the planet experienced a period of incredibly rapid sea level rise known as meltwater pulse 1A. Vast ice sheets collapsed, pouring enormous volumes of water into the oceans. Coastlines we would recognize today simply vanished, swallowed by the rising tides. For the early human communities living along those fertile shores, this was not a slow, gradual change. It was a violent, world-ending catastrophe. The land they lived on disappeared beneath the waves in a single lifetime. The global prevalence of these flood myths suggests that this was a real, historical event experienced by humanity's ancestors. The specific details found in these stories are what make them so compelling as historical records. They often mention the precise types of animals saved, reflecting the local fauna. They describe the duration of the flood and the methods used to find dry land again. These are not the vague imaginings of primitive storytellers. They are the specific, practical details of survivors. This global archetype of the flood shows us that our oldest stories are not mere fables. They are the durable containers for our most profound collective experiences. If the Great Flood was a real event preserved in myth, what other natural disasters were coded into the legends of angry gods, and shaking earth the rage of a volcano became the fury of a goddess? For the people of ancient Hawaii, the entity known as Pele was not a symbolic figure but a literal, living force. Her arguments with her sisters were the earthquakes that shook the island. Her tears were the lava flows that carved new landscapes. When she was angry, the very ground would split open and rivers of fire would pour toward the sea. This was not a vague allegory. It was a precise, operational model of a volcano, personified for memory and survival. The stories about Pele meticulously documented the warning signs that preceded her outbursts. They spoke of the ground growing warm, of tremors rumbling deep below, and of strange, acrid smells filling the air. These are the exact precursors modern geologists monitor today, the same signals of rising magma and pent-up pressure. The myth was a predictive tool, encoding generations of careful observation into a narrative that everyone could understand and retell. On the other side of the world, the Greeks told their own stories of terrestrial fury. The epic battle where Zeus defeats the Titans with his thunderous lightning bolts is a spectacle of divine warfare, yet some scholars hear a different echo in that tale. The descriptions of the world shaking, the sky turning black, and the earth itself cracking open bear a striking resemblance to the cataclysmic volcanic eruption of Thera around the year 1600 BCE. This event, one of the largest in human history, likely vaporized an entire island and sent tsunamis crashing across the Mediterranean. For the people who witnessed it or who inherited its traumatic memory, the only framework that could contain such immense power was a war among the gods. What we call mythology, they knew as lived experience. These narratives did more than just record a single past disaster. They formed a continuous feedback loop of observation and prediction. By watching for the signs of Pele's anger or remembering the portents that preceded Zeus's battle, a community could know when to move away from the coast or evacuate a mountainside. This was a sophisticated form of early warning system, a durable science passed down not in textbooks, but in tales of divine emotion and cosmic conflict. If volcanoes could be understood as the actions of temperamental deities, what other natural forces were personified in our oldest stories? The very ground beneath our feet has its own myths to tell. The earth has always spoken a language of its own, and ancient cultures were its most attentive students. They learned to interpret the subtle whispers and tremors that modern instruments now detect. Long before the invention of the seismograph, people noticed that water levels in village wells would mysteriously rise or fall, a sign of subterranean pressure building deep below. They saw how animals, with their acute senses, would flee an area or behave in bizarre, agitated ways just before the ground began to shake. These were not random superstitions. They were repeatable, observable patterns that formed the basis of a practical, life-saving science. This empirical knowledge was then woven into the fabric of myth to ensure it would never be forgotten. In Japanese folklore, the giant catfish Namezu lives buried under the islands, his thrashing causing the earth to tremble. This vibrant character almost certainly emerged from the real-world observation of eels and fish behaving erratically in ponds and rivers prior to seismic events, their sensitive bodies detecting the subtle shifts we cannot feel. Similarly, tales of a sky god's anger were often preceded by descriptions of peculiar green-tinged clouds, a phenomenon now known to sometimes precede severe tornadoes and hurricanes. These stories codified a sophisticated system of early warnings, turning generations of lived experience into a durable oral database. Each myth was a key that unlocked the meaning behind the Earth's signals, bridging the profound gap between ancient observation and modern empirical science. They were not just waiting for disaster, they were listening for its approach, So, if a simple story about a restless catfish could contain such precise geological insight, what other secrets are hidden within the world's most enduring legends? Plato's description of Atlantis is unnervingly precise. He did not write of a city fading slowly into myth, but of a powerful, advanced civilization that vanished into the ocean in a single day and night. For generations, this was treated as a philosopher's fable, a moral lesson about hubris. Yet what if this story was not an invention, but a memory? The timeline and details align with a known geological cataclysm, the volcanic eruption of Thera. This event around 1600 BCE was so colossal it literally tore the island apart, leaving behind the dramatic caldera we now call Santorini. The scale is almost impossible to overstate. The eruption ejected over 60 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere, and the subsequent collapse of the volcano sent tsunamis racing across the Aegean Sea. These were not ordinary waves. They were walls of water powerful enough to ravage the northern coast of Crete and cripple the sophisticated Minoan civilization, a society that indeed possessed advanced art, architecture, and plumbing, much like the legendary Atlanteans. Here, the myth provides a crucial, specific detail that moves it from fantasy into the realm of historical record. Plato described Atlantis as a series of concentric rings, a city of circles within circles. Look at a satellite image of the Santorini caldera today, and you see that same unmistakable pattern, a ghostly outline of a circular landmass with a central island. This is not a vague similarity. It is the blueprint of a place that once was. The story of Atlantis then becomes a powerful case study. It shows us how a culture can encode the trauma of a civilization-ending event, preserving the core truths of its suddenness, its link to the sea, and even the physical layout of the lost world. The narrative acts as a durable vessel, carrying the shock and awe of that disaster across more than 1,000 years to reach Plato's ears. If a tale as famous as Atlantis could be a geological report in disguise, how many other legendary sunken cities are waiting to be read not as fiction, but as the last echoes of a real catastrophe? The chilling prophecy of Ragnarok describes a winter unlike any other. For 3 long years, the sun would fail, and the world would be locked in an endless, bitter cold they called the Fimbulwinter. This was not just a backdrop for the end of the world. It reads like a clinical account of a volcanic winter, a climate disaster seared into memory. In the year 1783, a volcanic fissure in Iceland known as Laki tore open, not for a day but for 8 grueling months. It spewed toxic gases and a massive veil of ash and aerosols high into the atmosphere. This cloud did not just dim the sun, it altered the very climate of the northern hemisphere. Across Europe and North America, temperatures plummeted. Crops failed in the fields, leading to a famine that killed a significant portion of Iceland's population and livestock. The winter that followed was so severe that the Mississippi River was reported to have frozen solid at New Orleans. Now, imagine an eruption an order of magnitude larger than Laki, occurring in the distant past. The social and environmental collapse that would follow is almost unimaginable. The Norse myth of a 3-year winter with no summer is not a random number. It is a precise duration that matches the known atmospheric lifespan of these volcanic sulfate aerosols, which can circle the globe for years, reflecting sunlight away and plunging regions into a deep chill. The story of the Fimbulwinter is therefore more than an eschatological vision. It is a cultural memory of a real, protracted environmental catastrophe, a disaster so profound it was woven into their ultimate narrative about the death and rebirth of the world itself. This pattern is undeniable. From the fire of a Hawaiian goddess to the endless winter of the Norse gods, our ancestors were not just telling stories. They were building arcs of memory designed to carry vital survival data across generations. Their myths were their data, and we are only now learning how to read the code. The coastlines held in Australian Aboriginal stories are ancient maps. For over 7,000 years, the Dreamtime narratives of Indigenous Australians have been passed down with a precision that defies modern expectations. These are not vague legends, but astonishingly accurate descriptions of a world that vanished beneath the sea. They speak of river mouths, distinctive hills, and sheltered bays that are now completely submerged, their details preserved in song and story long after the water covered them. Modern geological surveys confirm the shape of this lost world. The sea level rise that followed the last ice age did indeed drown these exact coastal features, creating the shoreline we know today. The stories remember it perfectly. This is not a coincidence. It is the result of an unbroken oral tradition, a chain of knowledge so meticulously maintained that it has preserved a geographical record across more than 300 generations. Consider the Gunditjmara people's stories of the Budgebim volcano. Their narratives describe a fiery creation being who revealed himself, shaping the land with his teeth and blood, which became the lava flows. Geological dating confirms that Budgebim erupted at almost the exact same time these stories were first formed. This is not a myth invented long after the fact. It is a first-hand account, encoded and transmitted with stunning fidelity. This long-term memory fundamentally challenges our assumptions about history. We often equate literacy with detailed historical awareness. Yet here is a tradition that has carried a perfect image of a 7,000-year-old landscape in its collective mind. The mechanism is one of sacred responsibility. This knowledge was not casual folklore. It was a vital part of cultural identity and lore, repeated in ceremony and art with a discipline that ensured its survival. Each telling was an act of preservation, ensuring that the map of the old country was never lost. So we are left with a profound question. If oral traditions can preserve the memory of a coastline for millennia, what other chapters of our planet's history are we missing because we stopped listening to the stories? The survival of these stories for thousands of years is a testament to a forgotten technology, the human voice itself. Without the safety net of written records, ancient societies engineered their myths to be unforgettable. They transformed vital data into poetry, setting complex sequences of events to a strict rhythm and meter. The steady beat of a drum or the predictable cadence of a song provided a mental scaffold, locking every crucial detail into its proper place. A single misremembered word could break the pattern, alerting the storyteller to an error. This was not art for art's sake. It was a rigorous system of information integrity. The elders and knowledge keepers were more than performers. They were the living librarians of their people, trained from childhood to recite these narratives with perfect accuracy. They understood that the story of the sea god's wrath was not just a tale, it was a coastal flood map. The legend of the shaking earth encoded the specific animal behaviors that signaled an impending quake. This oral technology was so effective that it could preserve the memory of a coastline for over 7,000 years. So why did modern science take so long to listen? The very features that made these myths durable, their poetic and symbolic language, caused scholars to misclassify them as mere fiction. We dismissed the code because we did not recognize the container. We were looking for data in ledgers and failed to see it preserved in song. Science dismissed mythology as the antithesis of reason. For centuries, the dominant view in the Western world framed these ancient stories as the very definition of superstition, a primitive attempt to explain a frightening world before the dawn of true knowledge. Early geologists and historians, armed with their rigorous methods, largely ignored these narratives, seeing them as fundamentally incompatible with empirical evidence. How could a story about a giant catfish cause an earthquake possibly hold any value next to a seismograph's precise readings? This intellectual bias created a blind spot, causing generations of scholars to overlook the potential data encoded within the tales. But this perspective is now undergoing a profound shift. We are beginning to see that myth and science are not locked in a battle for truth. They are, in fact, different languages describing the same events. One uses the precise vocabulary of carbon dating and core samples, while the other uses the powerful grammar of gods and monsters. When we cross-reference these two records, something remarkable happens. The story of a 3-year winter aligns perfectly with the atmospheric science of volcanic aerosols. The description of a circular city matches the geological footprint of a colossal caldera. This reconciliation does not diminish science, it enriches it. It offers us a new kind of evidence, a long-term memory bank that can point us toward events that occurred in the deep past, long before written history began. So the question is no longer whether these stories are true in a literal sense, but what specific, predictive truths they carry within their symbolic shells. What practical warnings did our ancestors embed in these epic narratives to ensure our survival? Animals were the original seismographs. Long before our sensitive machines arrived, the natural world was broadcasting its own urgent forecasts. In the year 373 before the Common Era, the Greek city of Hellas was a bustling center of life until it vanished overnight, swallowed by the sea after a powerful earthquake. The Roman historian Aelian preserved a crucial detail in his records. He wrote that in the days before the disaster, the city's mice, weasels, and even centipedes were seen fleeing in a mass exodus, abandoning their homes as if they knew something the human residents did not. This was not a random anecdote. It was a documented observation, one that modern science now confirms. Animals possess sensory abilities far beyond our own. They can detect the subtlest shifts in the Earth's magnetic field, sense the minute release of gases like radon from deep underground, and hear the high-frequency sounds of fracturing rock that precede a major quake. Ancient cultures did not have the physics to explain these phenomena, but they possessed something just as vital: generations of meticulous observation. They noticed a consistent pattern that when the snakes left their burrows, the dogs began to howl for no reason, and the birds fell silent. The earth often soon followed with a violent shudder. This empirical data was far too important to leave as a simple farmer's tip, so they encoded it into the very structure of their myths, transforming observable fact into sacred narrative. Animals became the messengers of the gods, the clever creatures who possessed secret knowledge of the world's inner workings. In Japanese lore, the catfish Namezu thrashes before the earth shakes. In countless Native American traditions, the coyote or the raven acts as a trickster who also brings warnings. By wrapping the warning in a story, they ensured the lesson was remembered. The message was clear: pay attention when the animals act strangely. This was not superstition. It was a sophisticated, institutionalized early warning system, a principle that applied to far more than just earthquakes. So the next time you read a myth about a talking bird delivering a prophecy, look past the fantasy. Our ancestors were not just telling a story, they were handing down a survival manual, written in the behavior of the world's most sensitive instruments. The sky itself was once a vast, open book of warnings. Ancient cultures did not just look at the stars for navigation or to mark the seasons, they read them for signs of imminent change. When a brilliant comet streaked across the heavens, the Aztecs did not see a random ball of ice and rock. They saw a celestial firebrand, an omen of doom known as Citlalin-Popoca, the smoking star. This interpretation was likely born from a brutal, empirical truth. A comet's appearance is a rare and memorable event, one that could easily become linked in the cultural memory to a subsequent catastrophe, like a years-long drought that withered crops or a devastating epidemic that swept through the population. The story of the comet as a harbinger of doom was not simple superstition. It was a powerful mnemonic device that preserved a correlation between a celestial event and a period of extreme hardship. The same principle applies to the many myths describing a darkened sun or a blood-red moon. These are not just poetic images, they are precise descriptions of the atmospheric conditions following a colossal volcanic eruption. When a volcano like Thera or Symbolism explodes, it pumps enormous quantities of ash and sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere. These tiny particles act like a filter, scattering the sun's blue light and allowing only the longer red wavelengths to pass through. For years after the eruption, the sun would appear dimmed and white at noon, and the moon would glow an eerie, coppery red. A person living through such an event would witness these stunning changes in the sky and then live through the volcanic winter and famine that followed. The myth that emerged of a dying sun god or a moon stained with blood was a way to package that entire traumatic sequence into a single, unforgettable narrative. The causation was attributed to the gods, but the observed correlation was starkly real. By paying attention to these celestial and atmospheric signs, our ancestors were practicing a sophisticated form of pattern recognition. They were connecting dots between events in the sky and disasters on the ground, developing an early warning system written in the language of legend. This skill allowed them to anticipate periods of environmental stress, to prepare for hard times when the omens appeared. We are only now beginning to appreciate the depth of that ancient wisdom, realizing they were not just watching the stars, but reading the forecasts written there. A culture's survival depended on more than just remembering which way to run. It required processing the profound terror of the event itself. When an entire community witnesses the ground tearing open or the sea rising as a mountain, the psychological impact is as devastating as the physical destruction. How does a society make sense of such chaos? The answer lies in the narrative structure of myth. The inexplicable fury of a volcano became the tangible rage of the goddess Pele. A world-ending flood was reframed as the deliberate act of a displeased deity. By giving the disaster a cause, even a divine one, and a clear sequence of events, the myth imposed order on psychological chaos. It transformed a random, meaningless catastrophe into a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. This narrative framework was a powerful coping mechanism. It allowed a traumatized people to package their fear, grief, and loss into a coherent package that could be passed down. The myth did not just record that the flood happened, it encoded the emotional truth of the survivors, their desperation, their resilience, and their ultimate deliverance. This is why these stories resonate with such power millennia later. We are not just hearing a weather report from the ancient world, we are feeling the collective heartbeat of a people who endured the unthinkable. The longevity of these tales comes from this deep psychological roots. They are not cold data logs, they are the soul of a culture's memory, ensuring that future generations inherit not just a warning, but the profound emotional lessons about humility before nature and the unbreakable will to survive. The story itself becomes a form of cultural therapy, a way to heal by making the unbearable somehow understandable. Water in these ancient stories is never just water. It is the ultimate paradox, a giver of life that can also erase entire civilizations in a single, terrifying motion. This profound ambivalence is the very heart of the global flood myth. The deluge is never portrayed as a random accident. It is a deliberate, cleansing force, a divine punishment that washes away a world grown corrupt to make way for a new, purified beginning. This powerful symbolism almost certainly grew from the raw, lived experience of tsunamis and catastrophic river floods. A tsunami does not discriminate. It sweeps away the powerful and the weak, the virtuous and the wicked, resetting the social and physical landscape in a matter of hours. For the survivors, the world they knew was literally washed away, creating a stark before and after in their history. The story they told had to make sense of that total transformation. framing the indiscriminate violence of nature as a purposeful, moral reset. This narrative framework finds a haunting parallel in the logic of biology. The recurring theme of a single family or a pair of animals surviving to repopulate the world is not just a plot device. It mirrors the fundamental principle of life itself, that even after the most devastating mass extinction events, a remnant always persists. Life is tenacious, finding a way to continue and diversify from the smallest surviving populations. The myth, therefore, encodes a deep, observed truth about ecological resilience. It connects the cataclysmic event to the inevitable cycle of rebirth that follows. This understanding transforms the flood from a simple tale of destruction into a profound meditation on the cyclical nature of existence itself. Destruction and creation are two sides of the same coin, a concept that resonates with our modern understanding of forest fires that clear the way for new growth, or volcanic eruptions that create the most fertile soil. The myth provides a framework for accepting this terrifying yet generative cycle, a guide for navigating a world where chaos and order are locked in an eternal dance. If water holds such layered meaning, what other elemental forces are waiting in these stories to reveal their coded truths? Fire burns with a terrifying duality in our oldest stories. It is the ultimate weapon of divine judgment, yet also the essential spark of rebirth. When a civilization witnessed the raw, untamable force of a volcano, they did not see simple geology. They saw the breath of a dragon or the fiery spear of an angry god, a power so immense it could only be understood through myth. The Greek story of Phaethon is a perfect example of this encoding. The tale describes a young man who loses control of his father's sun chariot, flying too close to the earth and scorching the continents, turning Libya into a desert and darkening the skin of the Ethiopians. This reads like a fantastical fable, yet it holds the precise details of an ecological disaster. It could be a cultural memory of a period of extreme, multi-generational drought, a time when the sun itself seemed like an enemy. Or, some researchers suggest, it might describe the atmospheric effects of a close encounter with a comet, its debris and heat scarring the planet and altering climates. The story captures the sheer, indiscriminate power of celestial fire, framing it as a catastrophic failure of control. This pattern repeats across the globe. Wildfires that swept across entire landscapes were not random accidents. They were the cleansing wrath of a deity, purging the world of impurity. The myth does more than just record the destruction. It explains its terrifying scale. Yet, within these same fiery narratives, there is always a glimmer of hope. The very same cultures that told stories of world-scorching fires also understood fire's vital role in the cycle of life. They observed that after a wildfire, the forest floor was enriched with ash, and new, hardy shoots would push through the blackened earth. After a volcanic eruption, the land, though devastated, would eventually become some of the most fertile soil on the planet. The myth of the phoenix, the bird that is consumed by flames only to rise again from its own ashes, is the ultimate expression of this profound understanding. It is a symbol that perfectly encapsulates the entire natural process, from total annihilation to vibrant renewal. Our ancestors were not just afraid of fire, they respected its essential, transformative role in the world. Their stories were a way to reconcile its dual nature, to hold both the terror of the inferno and the promise of the green shoot in a single, unforgettable thought. If fire could be both destroyer and creator in their minds, what other elemental forces did they understand in such a beautifully complex way? This challenge of translation is like trying to read a map written in a language we have only partially learned. The word dragon itself is a perfect example. In ancient China, tales of earth-shaking dragons were commonplace. To the modern ear, this sounds like pure fantasy. But look closer at the descriptions. These dragons were often said to live deep underground, and their violent thrashing would cause the very ground to heave and split. Now look at a diagram of a tectonic fault line. It is a massive, sinuous fracture in the Earth's crust, a powerful serpentine shape locked in a constant, grinding struggle. When that built-up energy is finally released, the land does indeed seem to writhe and convulse. For a culture with no concept of plate tectonics, what better metaphor was there than a colossal, restless beast stirring in the depths? The dragon was not a literal monster. It was the most accurate available symbol for an unimaginably powerful and unpredictable geological force. The same principle applies to the thunderbolts of gods like Zeus or Thor. The sound of a thunderclap is a close cousin to the explosive boom of a volcanic eruption, and the fiery projectile hurled from the sky could just as easily describe a superheated rock launched from a volcanic vent as a bolt of lightning. The storytellers used the most powerful vocabulary they possessed to describe events that defied ordinary understanding. They reached for the language of the gods and monsters because the language of everyday life was simply inadequate. This is why understanding the local environment is so crucial to the decoding process. A myth from a landlocked culture about a sky god's anger will likely describe wind, hail, or drought. The same kind of myth from a volcanic island will almost certainly be filled with imagery of fire, ash, and burning rocks. The symbols are drawn directly from the world the storytellers knew. When a story from a coastal people describes a giant serpent rising from the sea to swallow the land, we must ask what that serpent represents. With our modern knowledge, the image is unmistakable: the towering, coiling form of a tsunami wave, a wall of water that does indeed seem like a living, malevolent entity emerging from the deep. The myth is a precise observation, cloaked in the most vivid metaphor their world allowed. So the next time you encounter a legend filled with impossible creatures, do not dismiss it. Look at the actions, the setting, and the consequences. You may be staring at a perfectly accurate geological report, waiting for its code to be broken. The same story told on opposite sides of the world cannot be a simple coincidence. When cultures isolated by vast oceans and impassable mountain ranges all preserve the same core narrative, we are hearing the echo of a shared reality. The global flood is the most famous example, but it is far from the only one. Consider the chilling story of the long winter. Norse mythology speaks of the Fimbulwinter, 3 years of unending snow that heralds the end of the world. On the other side of the globe, the Native American tribes of the Pacific Northwest tell of a time when the snow fell so deeply and for so long that entire villages were lost. The ancient Greeks wrote of a terrible age when the sun grew weak and the harvests failed for years on end. These are not variations of a single story that traveled the world. These are independent eyewitness accounts of the same global catastrophe. The most plausible culprit is a volcanic super-eruption, an event so powerful it can pump enough ash and sulfur into the stratosphere to lower global temperatures for years, creating a volcanic winter. A single eruption, like that of Mount Toba around 74,000 years ago, is theorized to have come close to wiping out humanity altogether. The stories of a long winter are the cultural scar tissue from such events, a memory of a time when the sun itself seemed to be dying. This independent verification is what transforms myth from local folklore into a global data set. When the same pattern emerges again and again without any possibility of cultural contact, we are no longer dealing with fiction. We are looking at a collective human memory, a deep time warning system that transcends language and geography. The myths are not just similar, they are corroborating each other's testimony across the millennia. If our ancestors, separated by entire continents, all felt compelled to tell their children the same terrifying story, what world-altering event were they trying so desperately to make us remember? Yet even the most durable story is a whisper passed through 1,000 ears. The myths that reach us today are not pristine recordings. They are echoes shaped by every generation that retold them. Details inevitably shift and blur over centuries of oral transmission. A community might experience a dozen devastating floods across 5 generations. But in the collective memory, those separate tragedies can fuse into a single, monumental event, the one great flood that defines their history. The timeline itself becomes compressed, collapsing centuries into the lifespan of a single hero. The cause of the disaster is also reframed through the lens of the culture's deepest beliefs. A tsunami triggered by a submarine earthquake is rarely remembered as a simple seismic event. It becomes the wrath of a sea god, a divine punishment levied against a king's arrogance or a people's moral failings. This attribution to supernatural causes is not a failure of observation, but a fundamental part of how ancient societies understood their place in the world. They saw human morality and the forces of nature as inextricably linked. This is why we find the same natural disaster described in vastly different ways across cultures. A volcanic eruption might be one culture's divine war and another's grief of a jilted lover. The core event, the eruption, is the same, but the explanation is filtered through entirely different worldviews. This is the crucial challenge and the great opportunity of using myth as data. We cannot read these stories as literal, blow-by-blow accounts. They are not that. Instead, we must learn to separate the natural event from its moral and supernatural framing. The key is to look for the consistent, physical details that survive every retelling. The direction the water came from, the types of animals that fled, the duration of the darkness, the shape of the landscape that was lost. These specific, observable facts are the durable data points embedded within the poetic narrative. To unlock their true value, we must place these stories alongside the other evidence: the layers of ash in the ice cores, the tsunami sands buried in coastal sediments, the ruins of cities abandoned after an earthquake. Mythology gives us the story, but archaeology and geology provide the timestamp and the forensics. When these different lines of evidence converge, when the myth of a sunken city points directly to a caldera that matches its description, we know we are no longer just interpreting a legend. We are listening to a memory, so the goal is not to prove every myth is true, but to understand that each one contains a seed of truth, waiting for the right key to unlock it. What other long-lost realities are waiting, not to be discovered but to be remembered? The wisdom of the past is actively saving lives in the present. In Japan, centuries-old tsunami stones stand silently along the coast, some as tall as a person, with inscriptions that deliver a stark command from the ancestors. Do not build your homes below this point. For generations, these markers were seen as curious relics until the tsunami of 2011. In the town of Enyoshi, the villagers had heeded the stone's warning, building their homes on high ground. When the devastating wave arrived, it stopped just 300 feet short of their houses, and the community was spared. The stone's simple message, a piece of mythic-level advice carved in rock, proved more accurate than some modern hazard maps. This is the practical power of ancestral knowledge, a form of data that operates on timescales modern science is only beginning to grasp. A myth describing a 500-year floodplain might seem like an exaggeration until you realize that our instrumental records often only cover the last 100 years. We are missing 4 centuries of climate patterns and geological activity. These ancient stories fill in the gaps, providing a long-term baseline for disaster probability that our short historical memory simply cannot see. The most resilient communities of the future will likely be those that learn to merge these 2 ways of knowing. They will use satellite imagery and seismic sensors, but they will also listen to the old tales about the river that once swallowed a village or the mountain that once breathed fire. This is not about replacing technology with tradition, but about creating a richer, deeper dialogue with our planet. It teaches us a profound humility, reminding us that our century of data is but a single sentence in a story that is thousands of years long. When we listen to that full story, we are not just preparing for the next disaster, we are rejoining a conversation with our collective past, one that holds the key to our collective future. But this quest for knowledge carries a profound responsibility. These ancient stories are far more than just geological datasets waiting to be cracked open. For countless communities around the world, they are the living heart of cultural heritage, a sacred inheritance that connects them to their ancestors and to the land itself. To treat them merely as codes to be broken is to risk stripping them of their soul, reducing a spiritual epic to a simple weather report. The true power of this research emerges only through genuine partnership and deep respect. When scientists and historians collaborate directly with indigenous knowledge keepers and cultural elders, something remarkable happens. The data gains its context and the story retains its spirit. This respectful dialogue acknowledges a vital truth, that Western empirical science is not the only valid way of knowing the world. It is one path, a powerful one, but it walks alongside other paths carved by millennia of intimate observation and spiritual understanding. By listening to these other ways of knowing, we do not weaken our scientific pursuit. We enrich it immeasurably, weaving together different strands of human insight into a stronger, more complete tapestry. This approach fosters a more humble and holistic view of our history and our place on this planet. It recognizes that our ancestors were not just primitive scientists, they were philosophers, theologians, and storytellers all at once. Their wisdom was not compartmentalized. The same story that warned of a tsunami also taught a lesson about humility, community, and the sacredness of the natural world. To ignore those layers is to miss the point entirely. So as we continue to listen for the echoes of ancient disasters, we must also listen to the voices of the people who have safeguarded these stories for generations. Their guidance ensures that our search for truth is not an act of extraction, but one of collaboration, honoring the past while building a wiser future for us all. The proof is no longer just in the story, but in the soil itself. Modern technology acts as a universal translator, allowing us to test the ancient claims preserved in myth against the hard data of the Earth. Take the story of a great flood. Researchers can now extract deep core samples from the sediment at the bottom of ancient lakes. These samples are like tree rings for the planet, creating a layered timeline of environmental history. Within that mud, scientists can find a distinct layer of sea sand and marine microfossils deposited far inland, a silent, physical testament to a catastrophic tsunami that swept across the land, precisely matching the date of a legendary deluge. This is not speculation anymore, it is forensic evidence. Similarly, ice cores drilled from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica trap tiny bubbles of the ancient atmosphere. They can reveal spikes in volcanic sulfates from a specific year, correlating exactly with myths from the other side of the world that describe a year without a summer or a sun that turned as pale as ash. Another revolutionary tool is LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. This technology uses laser pulses from an aircraft to map the ground surface, even through dense jungle canopy. It has revealed the ghostly footprints of entire civilizations, complete with road networks and building foundations, in areas that are now completely submerged along coastlines. These sunken landscapes, invisible to the naked eye, match the descriptions of lost lands from oral traditions with astonishing accuracy. And when a culture speaks of a specific mountain that once shook the world, seismological data can often confirm a long dormant fault line running directly beneath it, waiting to awaken. This technological corroboration is transforming geomythology from a fringe idea into a respected, data-driven science. Each core sample, each LiDAR map, each seismic reading is like a key turning in a lock. With every successful match between a myth and a material fact, these narratives are reborn. They are no longer just tales of gods and monsters, but validated historical documents, offering a unique and desperately needed long-term perspective on our planet's behavior. This convergence of lore and laboratory does not diminish the power of the stories. It amplifies it, creating a powerful new dialogue between the intuition of our ancestors and the instruments of our present. This emerging field, known as geomythology, is forging a new kind of science, one that listens to the whispers of folklore with the same seriousness it gives to seismic data. By weaving together geology, archaeology, and the deep study of oral tradition, it creates a far richer picture of our past. The future of this discipline shines with potential, powered by a simple but profound shift in perspective. We are finally learning to see the myth not as a problem to be solved, but as a partner in discovery. New technologies are the engines of this progress. Imagine sophisticated computer algorithms that can analyze thousands of myth variants from around the world, identifying the common environmental threads that run through them. Advanced geochemical analysis can now trace the origin of tsunami sands found deep inland, directly linking them to the specific volcanic eruption described in a local legend. As these tools become more refined, we can expect a cascade of lost chapters from Earth's history to be deciphered. Entire civilizations known only through story may find their physical footprints confirmed. But the value of this research is not just about understanding the past, it is about safeguarding our future. Local folklore often contains the most granular, location-specific warnings. A story about a river spirit that once flooded a valley beyond its banks is not just a tale, it is a 500-year floodplain map. A legend about a mountain that breathed fire long ago points directly to a volcanic threat that modern hazard assessments, based on shorter timelines, might underestimate. In an era of accelerating climate change, this long-term perspective is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Our planet operates on cycles that dwarf our brief historical records. These ancient stories give us access to that deeper memory, reminding us of patterns and extremes that we have never witnessed, but our ancestors survived. They offer a vital, time-tested wisdom for navigating a world that is becoming increasingly volatile. The next great discovery in disaster preparedness might not come from a new satellite, but from a very old story, patiently waiting for us to understand its language. This unified quest begins by tearing down the walls between academic fields. The full potential of these ancient warnings can only be unlocked when historians, linguists, geologists, and anthropologists sit at the same table. Each holds a piece of the puzzle, and only together can they see the complete picture. A geologist might identify a long, dormant fault line running directly beneath a settlement. A linguist studying the local dialect could then decode a specific, forgotten word in an old myth that describes the sound of the earth groaning. But without the anthropologist, that discovery remains an empty fact. The anthropologist provides the crucial cultural context, explaining why the people attributed that groaning to a buried giant dreaming of war, transforming a geological event into a story that made sense within their worldview. This is not a simple chain of command, but a continuous conversation. The geologist's data gives weight to the myth, while the myth gives a human voice to the geological data. This collaborative model actively breaks down the silos of overspecialization that have long kept these disciplines apart. It proves that a story is never just a story, and data is never just data. When these different ways of knowing converge, they create a feedback loop of discovery that enriches every field involved. The historian gains a new, validated event for the timeline. The geologist gains a long-term perspective on a fault's activity. The community who preserved the story gains scientific validation of their ancestral knowledge. This is how we build a more resilient, more complete understanding of our planet's past, not by competing for answers, but by sharing the questions. What other mysteries of the ancient world could be solved tomorrow if we only learned to listen to each other today? Our journey through these ancient stories reveals a profound truth about human resilience. We did not simply endure the chaos of the natural world. We mastered it by turning raw terror into timeless narrative. The flood, the earthquake, the erupting mountain, these were not just events to be survived and forgotten. They were lessons to be remembered, and our ancestors built the perfect container for that knowledge, the myth. This was their grand strategy for outlasting disaster, encoding survival data into the very bedrock of culture through poetry, character, and sacred story. They transformed their greatest fears into their most enduring legends, ensuring that the warning for the next tsunami or the next long winter would be sung by their children's children. We stand today as the inheritors of this immense library of lived experience. The old tales of dragons shaking the earth and gods darkening the sky are not relics of a superstitious past. They are a different kind of intelligence report, one written in the language of human memory. By learning to listen to them, we are not looking backward with nostalgia. We are looking forward with a crucial, long-term perspective our short historical records often lack. We gain access to a conversation with our collective past, a dialogue that holds essential keys for understanding the rhythms and extremes of our planet. The next chapter in our relationship with Earth may well depend on our ability to hear the wisdom in these ancient whispers. What story from your own heritage now sounds less like a fable and more like a warning from the deep past? Share it below and let's continue this conversation together.